Today, we are very happy to partner with the World Bank to present their Malaysia Economic Monitor titled Navigating Change. So with us, we have the whole team from World Bank KL office as well. So we want to welcome them. Before we kick into the important and serious stuff, so I would like to invite Dr. Hooi to give a welcoming remarks on behalf of Penang Institute.
Thank you, Timothy. Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome again to another one of these launches with the World Bank Group. We do that I think we do that every year, 2 or 3 times a year. So they are very regular guests here. But nevertheless, we are welcoming them as warmly as ever. I think they're on a road show, so they might be a bit tired, saying the same things every other night. But give them hell. Question their whatever the panelists wants to say. But let me give a warm welcome, truly, to Dr. Firas Sarat, who is relatively new, who came to Malaysia only 6 weeks ago. He is the country manager for the World Bank Malaysia, and we have Dr. Richard Record, who is the lead economist for the World Bank. And then we have Mr. Jeffrey Hwang, Group CEO for Qdos Flexcircuit, Mr. Ayappan Pappu Pillay, Chief Technology Officer for PDC Telco, and Mr. Yeoh Hooi, National Secretary for SAMENTA. Now we are in a period of reforms, as all of you would have noticed, and much of the news today is about institutional changes to the political system, about the replacement of personnel in key positions, about revelations of crimes committed by the old administration, about interrogations of first ladies, things like that. But it is a period of change, so that's to be expected. But one mustn't forget what's most important for the new government in the end is how well it manages the economy in the coming 2 years at least. I mean, that would be a crucial period for this direction to be set. So tonight we will not only learn about what the present economic situation of the country actually is, but also how Malaysia can make the most of the possibilities that the digital economy presents to a country like Malaysia and to a state like Penang. Now, Penang Institute itself has been deeply involved in formulating a digital transformation plan for the state of Penang, together with PDC Telco. And that plan is presently being discussed. It's in its final stages. It's being discussed with the state bureaucracy and with the civil service. And we hope that very soon we will have a final version that can be made public on how we are to handle industrialization 4.0 in Penang. So my researchers and I, along with the rest of you, of course, in the room tonight, would love to hear what the experts from the World Bank and the other panelists has to tell us. We look very much forward to what they have to say, and of course to the Q&A at the end of the evening. So let me pass the floor now, I think, to Dr. Firas Sarat, the World Bank's country manager for Malaysia.
So good evening, everyone. Dr. Hooi, friends and colleagues from the Penang Institute, it's a delight for myself and my colleagues from the World Bank Global Hub for Knowledge and Research in Malaysia to be with you here tonight to launch our MEM. Every 6 months we issue one of these, Malaysia Economic Monitoring Note, and in this note we summarize economic trends and then pick a topical theme, and the topical theme of this issue is the digital economy, and the panel, I think, will be discussing that in some depth. I would like to say on a personal note, and as Dr. Hooi said, I'm only 6 weeks in, so I'm sort of brand new and trying to get a good sense of this country, that when I first came, and ever since, mid-August, I got a vibe from my colleagues in the office and from everybody around me that there was something special about Penang. And I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was just a vibe that, Penang was sort of set apart from the other places in this country. And it could be, its level of ambition, where it wants to go for itself and its people, and the kind of future it wants to build. And maybe some of my colleagues in the World Bank team says it has to do something to do with the food offerings too, the nice food and restaurants in this city. But I would say it also reminds me of Saudi Arabia. I worked in the Gulf for many years, and in Saudi Arabia they always said Jeddah, the city in Jeddah, was different. It was something else, and I sort of got that sense here when I was in Malaysia. It also sort of reminded me of my own country, Jordan, which is small, but it tries to think big, with big dreams for its people and for its own future. So I'm delighted to be here in Penang and to learn more about it. And Richard, 2 or 3 days ago, had sent me a paper called Positioning Penang, which was written in 2010, and it talked a lot about the ambition of this place, and I'd like to sort of learn how far we've come since that time. But let me just say a few words, with your permission, about our hub in Kuala Lumpur, and then maybe a few things about this report. For those of you that don't know, our hub, a global hub for knowledge and research, was established in 2015 and reflects, in my mind, a long-standing partnership between the World Bank Group and Malaysia. And it's a way that for the World Bank to engage with a country that now has become upper middle income, and for Malaysia as an upper middle income country to still contribute to global development agendas. And it does so by sharing its own experiences with other countries, and by promoting cutting edge economic research with global impact. So we're very proud of this relationship, and we invite all of you to attend any of our events in Kuala Lumpur. Every 6 months or every 2 to 3 weeks we have things going on, and if you can't attend physically, there's always the ability to do so virtually. On this report in specific, and we had a subsequent report on the digital economy that we just launched recently, I think there are a few important messages that come out, and I'm sure Richard and our colleagues in the panel will go into some depth. We feel in the World Bank that the digital economy and disruptive technologies are not only the wave of the future, they are the current wave that is really cascading through all of the countries of the world, and they must be embraced if countries are going to be competitive and innovative and creative and productive. And I think this is maybe the big message, and specifically for Malaysia now on its journey towards high income and developed country status. So that is one big message too. And to get there, one of the big building blocks is having a digital economy in which connectivity is around, it's high quality, it's pervasive, and it's reliable and affordable as well. And in our report, you'll find a lot of analysis on maybe why the connectivity is not where it should be, and adoption as well by businesses in particular. And it has something to do with price and maybe the absence of sufficient competition in the fixed broad-based segment of the market. We also talk about digital entrepreneurship. There is a focus on taxation too, and taxation of the digital economy is something that all governments are still trying to figure out how you do it in an efficient and fair way. And the work that we are putting out now looks at this very carefully. I'll end just with something on entrepreneurship, digital economy, the entrepreneurship aspect of digital economy. We feel, I think this is the next big challenge for Malaysia, how Malaysia can get to the next phase, and that has a lot to do with skills development and the quality of educational outcomes. And when you look at Malaysia's standardized scores in math and in science for 4th graders and 8th graders, and you compare those scores with students around the world, I don't think Malaysia is where it wants to be. And I think this is probably the next big challenge. It will be reflected in a global report that we are coming out with in Bali, Indonesia in mid-October during the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. So we will be putting out a global report. There will be an index. And I don't know whether it will be an explicit ranking, but there will be a ranking there. And I think Malaysia will see where it ranks compared to countries. And what's important when it compares itself to countries of comparable income levels, it comes out, you know, somewhere in the middle or a bit below where it should be. And for me, I think this is the challenge that needs to be embraced and invested in, so Malaysia can make that leap forward into high income and developed country status within the next 6 years. So thank you very much, Dr. Hooi, for having us again. And I'll close with a quotation that I like by the poet William Yeats, who said that education is not so much about the filling of a bucket than it is about the lighting of a fire. And I think, keeping that fire alight, keeping the flame alight, and having it really produce the kind of light, the kind of productivity and innovation and creativity that Malaysia needs for now and for future generations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Firas. And now we would like to have Dr. Richard with us. He will be giving a presentation about this Malaysian Economic Monitor that he was identified as the task team leader in coming up with this report. So without further ado, I'll pass the stage to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you, Dato, for inviting us to Penang. It's my second time coming to the Penang Institute, although I've been to Penang rather more times than that, often just weekends and for good food, etc. So I'm going to present a little bit about the Malaysia Economic Monitor. For those of you who don't know, it's a report we produce in the World Bank in Malaysia every 6 months, and it has two halves. The first half looks at the economy, and this is where we publish our forecasts and our assessment and expectations on things like growth, inflation, trade, debt, fiscal policy, monetary policy. And then we always take a special topic and we pick one issue that we think is interesting, relevant, and a challenge for Malaysia as it looks forward to the medium-term development. And in this edition we looked at the digital economy, so I'll present a little bit of that in terms of some highlights. The title, though, as you'll see from the report, is Navigating Change. And essentially that is because this was our first public report since the change in government. We actually published it about 2 months ago, but we're spending the period since then going out and having discussions with groups such as yourselves, getting feedback and having a little bit of debate about exactly what kind of change is Malaysia going through and what does the government need to do to successfully navigate and ensure that Malaysia emerges stronger and able to ensure both not just high rates of growth, but more inclusive growth and economic growth, which is perhaps of a higher quality than I think as we've seen in the past. So in terms of the main messages, I think there are really three that we tried to emphasize through the report. Firstly, we really see the time right now as a tremendous opportunity for Malaysia to address some of those deep structural impediments and barriers to growth and equitable economic outcomes, which we know have constrained Malaysia for quite some time and have been difficult to address. So now really is the chance to undertake some of those bold and decisive reforms that I think we Malaysians have all been waiting for. Of course, it is a period of heightened uncertainty, Now, some of that has been directly for a while related to the electoral period and some uncertainty with the transition. But it's also a period of global uncertainty. We've seen trade tensions, worries about emerging markets, a lot of capital flows in and out of emerging market economies, including Malaysia, and pressures on currencies. And so this is a global context of which Malaysia is just one country among many, which is looking sort of a little bit apprehensively to what's going on outside. And we talk a little bit about that in the report. And thirdly and finally, I think it's really important to recognize that Malaysia's economic fundamentals remain very sound. The basics which got Malaysia where it is today haven't changed in terms of a diversified economy, a skilled population, a geographic location in the heart of the world's fastest growing and most economically important region. So first of all, I'll try and take you through a little bit in terms of the recent economic developments and how we see it from the World Bank's perspective, before then going on to the digital economy. So in terms of the regional and international context, and we always start here before looking at Malaysia's particular economy, it is interesting to see that over the last year, particularly from about the middle of 2016 until pretty much the end of 2017, we saw something that we call a synchronized recovery in growth between both advanced economies and emerging market economies. And essentially you can see those two lines sort of twisting upwards around the middle of 2016. That's something we hadn't seen for about 10 years, really pretty much since before the global financial crisis of 2008-9, where we see both advanced economies and emerging market economies picking up in terms of their growth a little bit. And of course what that means is that the world's trade-oriented and open economies, which Malaysia is one, but also the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, all saw an increased demand for their exports and something of an acceleration of growth through 2017. If you look at Malaysia's economy there, you can see that sort of acceleration that sort of started around the middle of 2016. Those are quarterly GDP growth figures. Although what we now see, which perhaps we didn't know a few months ago, is that driver pretty much peaked around the end of 2017. In fact, the economy was already starting to slow in about December. Certainly the increased demand for exports seemed to plateau, and we saw that the economy was beginning to drift down from the beginning of this year. The second quarter GDP growth figure was just, well, I say just 4.5%, but really that's probably more like the normal or expected rate of growth for Malaysia compared to the recent past. However, what's interesting is when we look back over 2017 and we break down GDP growth into its major components, we see that Malaysia's economy was sort of growing or firing on all four cylinders at the same time. So we saw strong export performance, again, mostly driven by that increased external demand. So exports were contributing positively to growth. Public investment was contributing positively to growth, mostly through major capital expenditure, as well as a bit of an acceleration of current expenditure from the beginning of this year. Also saw strong consumption and also strong private investment. And of course, what's interesting now is that dynamic is starting to change. But before we get into that, just again, that export story, you can really see how Malaysia's current account surplus and export performance suddenly jumped up in the middle of last year. I guess it would be interesting to hear all of you in Penang are maybe at the heart of that, so it'll be interesting to hear your perspectives. But certainly we saw an increase not just in manufacturers, but also in commodities as well. Helped, of course, by higher prices both for palm oil and oil and gas, which sort of helped a little bit in 2017. That certainly started to taper off by the end of last year and seems to be plateauing somewhat, or depending on the product classes through this year. When we look at consumption, what we do see from the outside is a continued stable rate of employment and unemployment. Although, and I haven't put it on a chart here, if you look at youth unemployment, the picture is actually is rather different, and certainly some of the numbers are worryingly high. But certainly some growing disparities in wages, and certainly I'm still quite new to Malaysia. I've only been here for 1 year. And I always tell this story, my colleagues have heard it many times. But as an economist, the first thing you do when you look at economy is look at the numbers. Okay, and so if you come from outside, if you come from Mars and you land in Malaysia, you see growth. Oh, the economy is growing quite fast. You look at inflation, it's very low, under 2%. And you look at per capita income, wow, it's nearly $10,000 per capita. On a global level, that's pretty high. So when you look at the numbers, you think, everything must be great in Malaysia. And of course, the minute you arrive and you actually start talking to Malaysians, you realize actually the picture is much more complicated than that. And so one of the things that we're trying to do in the World Bank is look beyond the averages and try and look beyond the numbers. And actually, when you do that, you start to see actually the picture is a little bit more complicated and nuanced. And one of the areas, if you look there, is on wages. So if you look at average wages in Malaysia from until about the second quarter of this year, growing around 6% on average. That doesn't sound too bad if prices are, say, inflation is only 2%. But then when you look at the breakdown, you see that actually very different wage growth in different parts of the economy. In manufacturing, it seems to be growing pretty fast, 10, 12, even as much as 14% one part of the year. But in services, much, much lower, barely 2.5, maybe 3%. So it's clear that different Malaysians are experiencing very different rates of wage growth. And so it's perhaps not surprising that depending on who you talk to, you say, actually, that's not the economy that I'm experiencing in terms of growth. And actually, you see a very similar pattern with inflation. So again, the headline numbers show that inflation is very low. And of course, what you see that sort of chart on the left-hand side where it's nosediving at the end. That's when GST was zeroed from June 1, and we saw even a lower rate of inflation. It'll pick back up again once the effects of SST come in. But what's really interesting, so headline inflation is barely 1 to 2%. But when you look at the different items within the basket of inflation, you see a very mixed pattern. And in fact, the two items that have seen the fastest rate of price increases over the last, in fact, 8 years, that's what that chart on the left-hand chart shows, is food and housing. And of course, these are the things that people notice and actually spend a large part of their income. But even more worrying, if you line up Malaysians from the poorest to the richest, in fact, you find the poorest 10% of Malaysians spend as much as 70% of their income on food and housing, the two things that are rising faster than anything else. So in fact, it's almost as if inflation is regressive in Malaysia, because those who are perhaps least able to manage and absorb price increases are actually experiencing the fastest rate of price increases. And then if you sort of imagine those Malaysians who are in a part of the economy with very low wage growth and experiencing high inflation, then it's clear that actually the average means very little, and there's a very different pattern going on behind that. So one important aspect that we're trying to look into. Also, of course, interestingly, that urban prices are rising quite a bit faster than rural prices, which has an interesting dynamic, particularly for those who are net food buyers. Going on to financial markets, of course, this has been, as I mentioned at the beginning, a period of volatility. That left-hand chart shows what's been going on for capital flows. We did see some capital outflows by particularly non-resident investors around May and June, principally non-resident investors in Malaysia's government securities. But certainly the size of the outflow is actually not particularly worrisome from our perspective. If you compared, and if I extended that chart to go back to, say, 2008-9, when there was a global financial crisis, the flows are actually not particularly large, and certainly very insignificant compared to 97-98. And in fact, they seem to have stabilized already, and in fact, we've seen a return inflow in net terms in August. Of course, the ringgit has depreciated in the last few months, but again, really the story there is more of the dollar appreciating rather than the ringgit weakening. And in fact, if you look at other currency pairs, what stands out is the Thai baht and the Malaysian ringgit, which have been comparatively stronger compared to other emerging market currencies. No surprise, that's the two countries that have current account surpluses compared to others in the region. Whereas if you look at the Indonesian rupiah, the Philippine peso, two large countries with significant current account deficits and a much stronger dependence on foreign capital flows, have seen a much larger depreciation. So it's, and of course this is in the context of interest rates rising in the United States, the impact of tax cuts, accelerating growth in the United States at the peak of the cycle, unemployment very low, and expectations of rising inflation, rising tightening monetary policy in the United States, as well as the impact of tax changes that are allowing American corporations to bring profits back into the United States. All of that sort of sucking money in and out of emerging markets, including Malaysia. And then if you add in a little bit of worry about Turkey, Argentina, some of the world's economic hotspots at the moment, then it's no surprise that emerging market economies are under a little bit of pressure, but Malaysia seems to be weathering the storm certainly better than many of the other economies in the region. debt has been debt used to be a very boring subject. It's now possibly the most exciting part when it comes to Malaysia's economy. I have here a chart which shows on the left federal government debt. That's Malaysia government securities. That's official borrowing, essentially the accumulation of deficits. It has been trending down towards the end of last year. The next chart is guaranteed debt. Those are official audited guarantees and contingent liabilities, which have been rising. And I always describe there's actually another chart on the right-hand side again that you can't see, which is the unofficial, unpublished contingent liabilities, which of course has been the story of the last few months. I think what isn't clear is we know how much we have a sense of how much the Malaysian government owes in terms of total liabilities. That's debt plus contingent liabilities plus additional liabilities. What's not quite clear yet is how those are going to be resolved. It hasn't been made entirely clear, and I think the Ministry of Finance is still working out how and if they will bring them onto the balance sheet. So for now, these are still the official numbers, and certainly how we see it, of federal debt plus contingent liabilities. So if you add them together, the federal debt plus guarantees, it comes to sort of almost 70% of GDP. The indications for the additional unpublished contingent liabilities is another 12-13% of GDP, and that's how we get to that 80% number which has been frequently talked about. Still some question mark about exactly which bucket we put them in from economic terms, but I think there don't seem to be any doubts about the total stock of liabilities that need to be reckoned with. Many people ask us, well, what number do you start to worry at? And certainly what we always say, there isn't a magic number and there isn't a ceiling or a line where suddenly it's okay and then it's not okay. What we always try to do is look at the trajectory, which is actually usually more important than the level. So where do you expect the fiscal policy pathway, including the accumulation of deficits, to be in 5, 10, 15 years? And then what happens if you shock an economy? So what happens if there's a major exchange rate depreciation? Fortunately, it doesn't have much of an impact on Malaysia's debt because it's 97, 98% in ringgit. Of course, that's very different to what things were like 20 years ago when we saw the Asian financial crisis, where we saw this sort of horrible, vicious cycle of depreciating currencies and appreciating debts. So that's fortunately one area of relative security. Secondly, we also look at rollover risks. So what happens if conditions suddenly tighten very quickly? Again, the bulk of Malaysia's debt is medium term, so there's a little bit of time to continue refinancing. But certainly when you combine the level of debt in the public sector with the level of debt in the private sector, which is also about 80% of GDP, then in relative terms, while Malaysia is perhaps, it doesn't look so bad if you compare with Japan or some other economies, but certainly compared to other economies at this level of development, Malaysia is more exposed, and certainly this is something that will need to be addressed over the medium term, and it is potentially a source of vulnerability. Looking forward, certainly we expect now to see this synchronized growth that I talked about a little bit is no longer something that we expect to see happening over the next couple of years. In fact, we're likely to see gradually slowing growth in the advanced economies. The US is doing well for now, but we don't expect it to last. Eventually those tax cuts will come around and hurt. Europe seems to be a little bit mixed. So we're expected continued reasonable performance in emerging markets, a little bit slower in advanced economies, but clearly many downside risks. Part of that is trade tensions, tightening monetary policy, risks of financial market volatility and contagion. There are a number of areas that are of growing concern that may bring those numbers down. For now, our projections look like that for Malaysia, although I would say we would expect those probably to be even a little bit lower looking ahead, just because the number of risk factors seem to be growing increasingly. What's clear, of course, is that the drivers of growth in Malaysia are changing a little bit. So we're still expecting consumption to be quite strong. In fact, consumption surged in the last few months when there was this 3-month tax holiday. I think everyone knows that. So there'll be a sort of boom, if you like, followed by probably a little bit of a hangover in the fourth quarter and the first quarter of next year on the consumption side. Private investment is perhaps, and maybe it'll be interesting to hear from you and the panel as well, because it seemed to slow down at the beginning of the year, ahead of the elections. It seems to have started to pick up again, but I think there's still a little bit of nervousness. Maybe it'll start to recover when there's a little bit more confidence with the midterm review of the 11th Malaysia Plan in the new budget on 2nd of November, giving a little bit more indication of the medium-term perspective for government policy. Exports, we expect to see a more moderate performance compared to in the past. And clearly what's going into reverse now is public investment. Expectations before, of course, were for continued large expenditure on things like ECRL, high-speed rail, and various other projects. Now, of course, building stuff creates economic activity in the short run, even if the infrastructure is not that productive, but then leads to large fiscal deficits and debt and liabilities in the future. But certainly from an economic growth perspective, if we slow that down, while it will help bring the debt down over the medium term, it does result in somewhat less economic activity in the short term. Perhaps helpfully, though, it will probably mean a little bit less imports. So if we see sort of moderation in export growth, fewer capital imports, then perhaps the current account surplus will remain fairly stable. Firas mentioned the high-income transition. It's something we're often asked about in the World Bank. We sort of run the numbers, or we have a team of people every year who run the numbers and classify countries from low income, lower middle, upper middle, and high income. And we try to look at different scenarios when Malaysia will pass that threshold. At the moment, it's $12,055 per capita per year, and that's a 3-year moving average of exchange rates. And we looked at a high, base, and low case scenario, really depending on the type of economic growth rate and the movement in the ringgit that Malaysia experiences. We think Malaysia will probably pass that threshold in about 2 to 6 years, depending on the assumptions. But what we always try to say is, you know, there's no prize for passing this threshold. It doesn't mean anything really, because you know, when the average per capita income passes that threshold, you know, the nature of the income curve, if you imagine there's nobody below zero, but there's some very high income people at the other end. So the average Malaysian is actually lower, you know, the median is lower than the mean. And then, you know, the whole story of the last year has been about the quality of growth. So it's, you know, it's one issue if the average is improving, but if the distribution is very skewed, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean a lot. And of course, there are many other dimensions of well-being and development success and progress beyond income, which matter equally in terms of environmental sustainability, in terms of institutional quality, and a whole range of other issues. I mentioned very briefly risks. We looked at those. They do seem to be weighed a little bit more to the downside. There has been, as I mentioned, a little bit more uncertainty about the fiscal and growth outlook through the political transition. I think we'll probably see that hopefully mitigated once the new budget comes out in just a few more weeks. As I mentioned before, the combination of both public and private debt is potentially a worrying sign, and something that I think the authorities will look to gradually bring down. On the external side, anything that might accelerate the pace of interest rate increases in the US, sucking more money out of emerging markets at a faster than expected rate would be a worry, or anything that triggers volatility or panic or fear of contagion spreading from some of those hotspots like Turkey and Argentina would be something to worry about. And of course, trade protectionism. For now, we think it's not too frightening. Tariff increases in themselves don't have a huge impact on countries like Malaysia. What's lost on one hand is sort of gained in the other in terms of trade diversion. As long as the demand in the final market, be it the United States or else, remains robust, then it does and should translate mostly through to Malaysia. The bigger worry is if those tariff tensions spread into a wider contagion and a loss of confidence, resulting into slower growth in the United States, slower investment in the global economy, and that, of course, will affect everyone, including Malaysia. Finally, in terms of messages, we do think this is really a time of opportunity. This is the chance for Malaysia, and particularly Malaysia's government, to address some of those reforms that we know have held Malaysia back for a long time. And now perhaps there's really a chance to undertake the necessary, deep, and sometimes painful reform areas around distortions in product markets, around competition, around education, innovation, and maximizing the potential of the digital economy. So in the second part, I'm going to talk a little bit about our work on the digital economy. And as was mentioned at the beginning, we use something here called the World Bank's Digital Adoption Index. And this is a tool that the World Bank developed as part of our World Development Report, which is every year we do a report on one issue that we think is very important for the whole world. And we developed this index that measures the rate of digital adoption and it's broken down into individuals, businesses, and governments. And we look at all the countries of the world, and then in Malaysia we looked at different states as well to try and map out what it looks like. And firstly, what's striking is that Malaysia has a very astonishingly high rate of digital adoption by individuals. That's by ordinary people, Malaysians. If you look, all these dots are countries around the world, and Malaysia is highlighted there, and the trend line shows the sort of line of averages and where you would expect countries to be at relative levels of income. And what it shows is actually over 80%, I think the exact number is about 82% of Malaysians are online or connected to the internet. And that basically is the sort of platform on which digital adoption can take place. I mean, if you imagine many other countries at similar levels of development to Malaysia, might only be 40, 50, 60% of the population online. So you have a huge exclusion problem. Not to say that there isn't an issue with the remaining 20% who are not online, but still Malaysia has a great starting point for this race to sort of make the most of digital technologies. And it's mostly through mobile networks. But there's a but, and the but that we find is that in contrast, Malaysia's businesses don't seem to be doing quite so well. In fact, you can see there Malaysia is below the trend line. And it's clearly, again, if you sort of, first thing you come into Malaysia, you think, oh, Grab, Fave, iFlix, this is the sort of the land of digital opportunity. And yes, there are many sort of superstar digital champions in Malaysia. But if you look at the entirety of the private sector, particularly SMEs, you actually see many are lagging behind and don't seem to be adopting digital technologies at the rate they quite should do. Now, of course, Penang is a little bit of an outlier as well, because we see much higher digital adoption in the manufacturing sector. But again, Malaysia as a whole, things seem to be a little bit slower than we would expect. So that chart on the right shows some of the adoption rates of different digital technologies. Now, clearly, everyone has email. That's not a big deal. Most firms do internet banking. The frequency of use of websites is not too bad either, and many use platforms like Facebook and Alibaba, Lazada, etc. for e-commerce activities. But the rate really tails off quite quickly, especially outside manufacturing for other digital technologies and activities. So comparatively few firms, for example, hire employees online or deliver services. And if you extended that chart to include Industry 4.0 techniques like Internet of Things, cloud computing, big data analytics, we're really talking about a relatively small number of firms and small share of the private sector. So we tried to understand why might this be. And one of the issues that seemed to be a constraining factor from our perspective is the relatively low rate of fixed broadband adoption and utilization. That chart on the left-hand chart compares countries and their rate of adoption by firms or households for fixed or fiber broadband connections. And you can see Malaysia is at just 8%. Singapore is 99%, but people always say, well, you can't compare with Singapore. It's not a real comparator. But even Korea is 85%, China 73%. And I think if we're talking about aspirations for digital technologies, Korea in particular is where everyone's sort of looking towards. And many people say, well, does it matter? Why not just use mobile? But mobile is great for consumption. It's great for the internet as a democratizing force of connecting as many people as quickly as possible. But if we're serious about deep digital adoption and adoption of deep technologies, you need ultra-fast connections and ultra-stable connections. And that only really comes through fiber optic connectivity. So while Malaysia has invested heavily in network infrastructure, the utilization rate seems to be pretty poor. And actually, that chart on the right-hand side shows that the costs are much higher than we would expect, again, for Malaysia's level of development. And why might that be? Well, partly it seems to be down to competition. Now, it's not always the case, but generally in most places and in most markets where you have multiple players competing, then you get the best possible market outcome in terms of lower costs and higher quality of service. And pretty much you see that in Malaysia's mobile market, where there are, 3, 4 major players all competing, driving prices down and innovating in the product market. That pie chart on the left-hand side shows Malaysia's fixed fiber network market. And you can compare it with 2 examples that we have there, which is Korea and Japan. Now, Korea, by our ranking, is the world's second most affordable market for broadband fiber connections. And you see 4 major players in that market. Similar pattern in Japan. Malaysia, the incumbent, which is Telecom Malaysia, has over 90% market share. Now, not necessarily that they're the bad guys, but when you have one firm absolutely dominant in one market, then it's inevitable that they face a different type of set of incentives. And in fact, when you look at Malaysia, it looks remarkably similar to what France did about 10 years ago, where France Telecom had excellent infrastructure, nobody doubts the quality of the investment, but extremely dominant operator, and a lack of competitive pressures. And what France did, and which is what we think Malaysia could do, was through the regulatory policies is force that firm to open up their infrastructure on a fair basis and a competitive basis and allow virtual competitors to come in, utilizing the same infrastructure and offering competing services. And France today looks very different. In fact, it was lagging significantly, and it's now, in fact, overtaken European averages in terms of broadband speeds, connectivity, and pricing. Another particular challenge as well that we noticed and highlighted reflects Malaysia's nature as a federal state and the role that states have over land policies. Certainly, Malaysia is one of the more expensive countries around the world when it comes to deploying new infrastructure in telecommunications. A number of states use mandatory state-backed infrastructure providers, which raises the cost of deployment. I think Penang is one of the few that has an open market. And many states, I'm interested to hear what the case is from Penang, have very complex licensing requirements for telecommunications infrastructure, where base stations have to be relicensed every year, and essentially treating telecommunications and particularly fiber networks as economic infrastructure rather than sort of social and national infrastructure. And one of our recommendations here is that we really need to start thinking about broadband fiber networks as a utility. In the same way that water and electricity is treated and it has mandatory right-of-way, every new construction has default deployment. We really need to start thinking about this for broadband internet. And in fact, again, that's what Korea is already doing and seems to be setting a pathway. I added 2 extra slides where I tried to highlight Penang in terms of comparisons. It's probably not that easy to see, although I will leave the slides with you. The left-hand chart shows penetration rates, and you can see actually Penang performs very highly. I think it's the 3rd highest rate of penetration for fixed broadband and also for mobile broadband. Although speeds seem to be not great. In fact, very, very middling, which is a little bit surprising. I'm interested to hear your perspectives on why that might be. But certainly when you consider that Penang actually is the sort of top end of Malaysia's digital adoption, given the high intensity of manufacturing firms, which are the firms who are adopting technologies much more than others, yet seems to be sort of stuck with comparatively low speeds. Again, perhaps there's a even more stronger need for increased competition in that particular area. Finally, business adoption. Again, if you look at the compare states, Penang is right in there in the middle. It seems to have been quite slow around 2010, accelerating into 2015. We'll very soon have 2017 numbers. It'll be interesting to see how, where that positioning is right now. Our final slide is basically what we think Malaysia needs to do to address and unblock this impediment for deep digital adoption. And I would stress this is just one aspect of the digital economy, but it's the one that we think is particularly pressing and one which is most amenable to policy changes. But firstly and most importantly, there's a strong need to promote more competition in the existing fixed fiber broadband market. We think that can be done comparatively easy in the same way that France did about 10 years ago by implementing the regulatory framework in a much more robust manner. In fact, Malaysia already has great competition laws, all the rules and regulations on sharing infrastructure in place. It just needs a little bit more oomph to actually force it through and really allow new entrants to directly access Telecom Malaysia's infrastructure right from the landing stations on a fair and equitable basis. And that's the first area. Second, and that can be achieved very quickly. Secondly, there's perhaps an opportunity to encourage greater new investment. Over the next few years, we think that's certainly possible. The obvious one is by opening up the existing unused infrastructure, which TNB has. TNB also has a national fiber infrastructure, currently utilize less than 1% of its capacity. This is another way to quickly bring in new competition. It doesn't necessarily need to be TNB itself, but somebody else using that infrastructure and perhaps trying to address some of these blockages. Treating internet, particularly fiber networks, as a utility would also help. And thirdly, perhaps using some of the existing public service programs to encourage new competition and new entrants. What we have seen in the past is that essentially TM has been sort of weighed down by a dominant position and expectation that they will win every single public sector contract on HSBC, HSBB, SUBB, etc. And perhaps trying to use some of those policies and programs to encourage new market entrants might achieve both social functions as well as getting new competition in a quick way. Fortunately, I would say we have seen some very encouraging signs in the last couple of months, and really it almost seems like there's a new announcement every week when it comes to fixing this problem. But it does require, it's more than just making an announcement. It requires intense follow-through on the regulatory environment and really trying to make this market work so that we see the type of dynamics that I think Malaysia really needs to accelerate on digital adoption. So that's the end of the presentation. We have lots of resources there, including on our website. I think we brought several copies of the report, but you can download it there, as well as we have our full digital economy report, which goes into more depth if you're interested, also available on our website at worldbank.org/Malaysia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Richard. Certainly a very good overall view about our economy and also touching a lot about the digital economy. We are going to go into a time of panel discussion. And I know a lot of us are excited about the digital economy, but what we are really going to touch on today is what the World Bank calls digital adoption, which is the adoption of internet connection. And so we have different representatives from different stakeholders to kind of bring in some of the views regarding this topic. So the first person I would like to introduce and to come on stage is Dr. Richard Rackett again, lead economist from World Bank Malaysia. Can you take a seat? And the second person we have on our panel today is Mr. Jeffrey Hwang. He is Group CEO of Qdos Flexcircuit, a big manufacturing company here in Penang. And next on our panelist is Mr. Ayappan Pappu Pillay. He is the Chief Technology Officer of PDC Telecommunication Services, a subsidiary of the state government. Thank you. And finally, we have Mr. Yeoh Hooi. He is the Honorary National Secretary of the Small and Medium Enterprise Association, or SAMENTA. Could you come up? And finally, I'll be your moderator for today. I'm Timothy, an analyst with the Socioeconomics and Statistics Department here in Penang Institute. All right, thank you all for coming. So how we're going to do this is we'll just run through very quickly one or two questions, and then so that the audience can kind of get an idea what you do and what which stakeholder you represent, and then we would open the floor to as many questions as possible for tonight. So my question is, with faster and cheaper, more quality internet, why would you think that would equal to realization of digital potential and not just people watching faster movies on Netflix? Yeah.
No, I mean, we think it's a major barrier, and in fact there are a lot of surveys. I think there was an FMM survey that was done quite recently that highlighted the cost of internet connectivity as being a barrier. Now, it doesn't matter if you're a big firm, and that's one of the reasons. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why large firms and in fact many of Malaysia's larger firms are manufacturing ones, and we see that the rate of adoption is much higher. But it is an impediment for smaller firms, and we think lower costs and would certainly help, and faster connection speeds would certainly help. You're right, though, it's not the only thing. There are a number of other issues as well. There's still a lack of confidence in digital payments in Malaysia. That's one of the other findings that we have. In fact, Malaysia has a very high rate of financial inclusion. So the Malaysians and Malaysian firms are all pretty much well banked. It's well over 90%. But when you look at use of electronic payments, it tails off very, very quickly, which suggests there's still some sort of nervousness, lack of confidence. That both discourages digital innovation, and it requires existing digital innovators to have both cash and electronic means of delivery, which is more complicated as well. And there are a number of other issues as well. I think in a number of sectors we see perhaps lack of competition. Often the role of state and GLCs sort of, affects competitive dynamics and perhaps doesn't force firms to adopt digital technologies or allow new entrants with digital models to compete more effectively. And as Firas mentioned as well, while Malaysia performs pretty well in terms of foundational skills in literacy and numeracy, it's probably short of where I think Malaysians' aspirations would lie. And so there's a little bit of a gap as well to be closed in. So there are a number of issues, but we think this cost issue really stands out, and this lack of competition really stands out. I mean, Malaysia is, when you look at the other countries around the world that have a similar market structure to Malaysia on fixed and fiber, I mean, it's not the sort of grouping that we would expect to see Malaysia in, and it's easily solvable with public policy. So, we know education will take a long time, but fixing competition in the fixed and fiber market, that can be done in a year.
Yep, all right, thank you for your views on this. We will quickly run through so that we can also open the questions to the floor. And I think our next question will be to Mr. Jeffrey Hwang. So I think you represent a very big manufacturing company here in Penang, and one which we would identify as successful and being kind of a frontier firm, right? A company that develops your own technology as well. So my question to you is, how important or integral is internet connection to your expansion and to your business as a whole?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invite. Before I answer that question, I always like talking to economists. Richard, for example, I always get excited because they talk about inflation. In my industry, they talk about cost down every day. So we are wondering why, hey, Mr. Customer, everyone is talking about inflation, why, it's always cost down in the industry. So that links us back to the previous question, the internet connection, because in our industry, we're expected to improve, and the improvement rate has to be faster than economic growth rate. So this is one example. Why internet connection? Well, internet connection is just one of the many factors in productivity measurement. So in fact, internet connection, I would say is just step number one. You get a good broadband. But end of the day is the software. If you talk about Internet of Things, if you talk about industrial automation, it's all going to be software related. And that's why it's a very interesting trend that Richard pointed out just now. The internet penetration rate is very high in Malaysia, but to many companies, the adoption rate is very low. You know the reason? Because the software that people use, like Facebook, Insta, even what do you call that? All the WeChat, all this software. Does it cost anything? Nothing. To company, especially in Penang, this part of the world, what we enjoy the most is Penang. Well, of course, we enjoy free stuff, but next would be, Pangi Atuate. That means big and cheap. So a lot of the software, like if you talk about ERP software, SAP, Oracle, all these cost a bomb. So this is something that perhaps, that's why I'm very excited to see, some local startups like Exabytes coming out. They perhaps are writing their own software. So this can, tackle the local demand. Unless, SAP has got some cheaper version, to cost down. But end of the day, I think ultimately the cost of operation and productivity that we're talking about here.
So am I to correctly understand that what you're saying is that having an internet connection is not just all, it's the second step after, which is looking at the software and really what productivity benefits that it can bring, right? Yeah, and I think a follow-up question to this is, so we talk about, yes, I adopt an internet connection, now I can bring in software and the different technologies that are available. But in your experience, did your company need to go through very fundamental structural change, or in terms of the kind of people that you hire, the culture that you build, simply because you want to reap the benefits of digital technologies and the technologies that comes with it?
Well, absolutely, yes. Well, it's funny, when I first joined the company, I saw, 7, 8 years ago, someone actually sitting in front of a computer, looking at Excel with probably a couple of lines of data. So what they're doing is have a calculator, a big one, and they're pressing, this one, 5 plus 25, all this. Hey guys, there's this auto sum, I got shocked. So, so the first thing we did, hey guys, we got to give you, at least some, workable Excel and some training, and then we move forward to some ERP implementation, because otherwise, when it comes to planning, you've got big sheet of things. So, my boss not too happy with me the first couple of years, because I spent a lot of IT infrastructure. Of course, with all the laptops and all the new ERP investment, you're going to have some database center as well. But we managed to find some good ERP system, implemented it. So I think productivity-wise, went up. But it's a funny mix as well, because of course, we have experienced stuff in my industry. You want to have experience, we value experience a lot. But at the same time, it's funny how the millennials take this up easily. To them, digital adoption is so natural. You don't have to train them for Excel. You don't have to train them to do auto sum, on Excel. They do it naturally. So, but you get a lot of youngsters. We recently got some of them have been to my factory today. So they've seen how we have taken some young chaps to expedite the digital adoption, and at the same time we send our experienced guys for retraining when it comes to digital adoption.
Yeah, all right. Thank you. Thanks for the insights. So our next question will be to Mr. Ayappan. So can you explain a little bit about what PDC Telco does on behalf of the state?
Actually, PDC Telco is a state backup company, which is supported by the state, but we are privatized. So we have the network facility provider license and also network service provider license. So we can build towers, infra, and so on for the NFP. And service, we only can do broadband, not voice. So we call as a OSA. We are this one-stop center agency for approving all the infra in Penang State. Let's say any telco applies, they should go through us, then we will apply, then we'll send to the agency for approval. So we are the one-stop agency. Okay. So this is our main task.
Yeah, and one interesting thing that Dr. Richard brought up was the idea about broadband as a utility. Okay. And I think in our work together as well, we did talk about this. Can you explain a little bit about that, and why is it not happening yet, maybe?
Currently, for example, we take Batu Kawan. So Batu Kawan, mostly we are talking about water, electricity. There is no utility on telecommunication. So we came up with a process telling that we want to put a utility as one of the procedure or policy to be included in the agencies. So that means that they should give us an area for tower, and also they should build all the ducts and subducts. Currently, all the developers and PDC builds all the infra, but not the tower, and they don't give us space. So sometimes when we want to build something, then people will protest. So this is the problem happening. So currently we are pushing the MMK or the YBs to include the utilities of telco as one of the policies.
Yeah, and I think this is also what Dr. Richard was talking about, as we have the ideas, we know what to do, but it's really the change, navigating the change of some of these old processes. Yeah, thank you. And I think finally we have Mr. Yeoh. So you are representing small and medium enterprises here. So as we talked about just now, Mr. Jeffrey was explaining that, yeah, we can retrain people, and he got a little bit of backlash for investing in ICT infrastructure in his first few years. So the question here is, like, sometimes when we talk to small businesses, they would tell me like, oh, I need an internet connection. It's very expensive. So Dr. Richard will say, okay, we lower down costs, we open up markets to be more competitive. the next thing SMEs would come and tell us is that, oh, now I've got internet connection, but some of the systems are really expensive. Cost is still an issue. Maybe you can give us a little bit of insight about how SMEs think about internet connectivity and technologies in their growth plans.
Yeah, thanks, Timothy. I actually take a different position when it comes to adoption of digital technology by SMEs. First of all, I think it's to understand the definition of SMEs. The bulk of SMEs are still micro enterprises. Like I said, 76%, if you look at DOSM statistics, says that they are micro enterprises. So how many of these keropok sellers, prawn cracker sellers are actually adopting the digital technology? Well, again, that's something that I'm not too worried about. But if you were to survey, for example, the S and the M's, let's just do a quick survey. How many of you are SME owners here, or you work for SMEs? Do you have internet adoption? Put up your hand. I mean, emails, websites, Facebook, whatever. I mean, just show of hands, quick show of hands. SME owners, or you work for SMEs? Show of hands. That few? I mean, come on. I mean, you don't have corporate emails, or you don't use internet, or you don't have websites. I mean, So I think Malaysians tend to be very shy when it comes to putting up their hands. I don't know. Maybe they are just a bit lazy to put up their hands. But okay, just back to something more serious. Is that the reality is that yes, I totally agree that the cost of broadband fiber optics needs to be brought down. Speed has to be improved. I was in Yangon not too long ago, and I think the broadband speed there is actually faster than than Malaysia, and I was actually quite shocked. But moving onwards, forget about Industry 4.0 for SMEs. I'm talking about SMEs, AI, AR kind of thing. Simple things like what Jeffrey was talking about, ERP. But ERP today, SAP Business One is actually on the cloud. It's on a subscription model basis. SMEs can actually afford. But again, the speed is important, because if you don't have fast enough speed, you won't be able to have an efficient cloud-based system, is what Richard has mentioned just now. So there are a lot of things, CRM systems now that are very, very much on a subscription-based model. So cost is not really a big factor today. You just pay a couple of $100 per user, so you can afford. But the speed is important. Without that, it affects your engagement with your customers and your suppliers. For example, if I'm going to be interacting with you online, I need that kind of speed so that I can have an efficient processing of my transactions. So I think basically I'm more concerned about things like the speed of the broadband, bringing down the cost so that it becomes affordable in terms of the infrastructure. Software, I think it has really come down to a level that has become affordable. And if you look at the incentives given by the government through, whether it is like Google is now trying to help promote 1,000 SMEs to go global. The Martrade has been giving grants for SMEs to go global and things like that. So there are a lot of these opportunities. Service providers, telco service providers have been conducting seminars over and over again, whether it's DG or Maxis or you name it. The thing is that there's no more excuse to say that you don't know how to get access to all these kind of things. Bring down the costs, exactly, and I think the next step will be then for the SMEs to embrace it, because when the cost becomes high and the speed is slow, that affects the processing of the transactions. I think that's my position.
So are you saying that systems like SAP today, it's not used to the fullest because speed is a problem. So, but yet we have businesses that are huge who are already today using, and they seem to be able to use it well. So, do you have a response to that?
The thing is that when you say big businesses that are using it, okay, do they have their own private servers, things like that? So, is it on their own private cloud system? Now you're talking about a public cloud system, because SMEs cannot afford to have a private cloud system. I mean, you're looking at going public, tapping the public cloud system. So you've got to bring down the cost to make it easy enough for the SMEs to embrace that. To facilitate, and that's what public policy is all about, and to bring down the cost, to facilitate, and that's like people like PDC Telco, the government, I mean, the minister has been talking about getting the telco service providers to bring down the cost by September 30th or something. I mean, well, let's see what happens after September 30th. Whether the cost really comes down. So I think it is a process. Of course, I'm not saying that that's the only reason, but I think as what have been uncovered in the report, the cost and speed are definitely two major factors that are impediments, I think. Yeah.
And is there a case to be made that there are some SMEs who do not need internet connection? So I think interestingly, in the World Bank Enterprise Survey, about 60% of businesses do not own a website, right? And if we go into the details, some of these are actually kind of like motorbike shops, right? Those that repair, and we have a lot of businesses in Penang. Let's say if you are those who sell the popular Penang crackers and things like that, your suppliers are all your neighbors, and you do very manual delivery. Your customers are basically customers that your parents pass down to you. So when we talk about digital technology and digital disruptions to these people, some of these SMEs would say, I don't really need it, business is good, and even if I adopt this kind of thing, I don't have the manpower, I don't have kind of, I don't need some of these technologies because business is okay and I don't intend to grow so big. Is there a case to be made for such businesses?
Of course, there will be certain types of businesses which may not want to expand at that kind of pace. But then, having said that, if you look at the dominant economic sector today is services, and if you look at cafes, restaurants, even like just go to a place called Seng and you see the throngs of crowd queuing up. How do they reach out to their so-called foreign customers? You see a lot of foreign travelers queuing up in front of Seng. I mean, it's what, Facebook, Instagram, TripAdvisor, things like that. I mean, they still have that kind of internet connection. Of course, they may not be going further as what Richard has shown in the report. It's just the simple digital adoption. But they have not gone into probably like using cloud-based systems or going further into e-commerce and things like that. The adoption of e-commerce is probably still very, very much lacking. That I totally agree as far as SMEs are concerned. Getting them to even register with DFTZ, I think the government is really going all out trying to persuade SMEs to please register with the DFTZ. But having said that, again, there are other factors. It's not just the internet aspects. In the past, for SMEs, it was always fulfillment, which was actually a big constraint, because when you're dealing with B2Cs, in the e-commerce space, fulfillment becomes an issue for SMEs to be sorting, picking products, selling to just like an individual consumer that buys a small quantity. But now with services like FBA, with DFTZ, I think that helps to increase the adoption again of e-commerce, because you don't have to do the fulfillment by yourself now. You can just drop off a few cartons of your products with Amazon and they can actually process the whole thing and ship it out for you. And you just see your money credited into your account. So all these things are improvements that helps SMEs. I mean, look at China, with Alibaba. How did SMEs in China move into the e-commerce space? That's a typical example. It can be done. It's just a question of changing a mindset, I think.
Yeah. Any of you have anything to?
Can I answer this question? Why broadband is expensive?
Sure.
And why it's
sure.
slow?
We want to know.
Okay, when we're talking about broadband, okay, from the house or from the office, we have a local loop going to a POI, point of interconnect. Then it goes to backhaul. Then from backhaul it goes to submarine cable. Submarine cable, then it goes to overseas. So submarine cable, the capacity is not a lot and it's expensive. And nowadays we're talking about, for example, we have a private IP transit and public IP transit. So when you talk about the private IP transit, it is very expensive, but quality is good. But most telcos in Malaysia, sometimes they go through private, public IP transit, which we only have two nodes in Malaysia. One is MYIX in KL, another one is JBIX. The other IX all closed down because currently MCMC is not giving a grant to them. So this is the cost. And all the submarine cable is controlled by Time Telecom and Telecom Malaysia. So all the other telcos wait outside from the submarine cable, so they need to have an interconnect charge, another charge. So they will come, have a lot of charges in between. So when they come for example, in Penang State, when you're doing a trenching in Penang State, so before they apply, they have to go to all the agencies. We have councils, we have JKR and so on. So all these people will charge you a deposit. Comes from 50,000 to 400,000, a deposit. So this deposit is a payback after 1 year. If let's say you do some not good job, they won't pay you back. And furthermore, so these telcos will do the fiber laying, not follow the standards. So when they don't follow standard, the fiber is just laid somewhere, something. So this will cause degradation when the fiber is cut. So the internet becomes slow. So when let's say, for example, you get something from Telecom says, I give you 1 gig. But the 1 gig is until the submarine cable. After the submarine cable is the best effort. Everybody have to fight. So when they go to submarine cable, they always have no diversity, only one. So you want to buy diversity, it's very costly. So let's say suddenly you have 10 gig or 100 gig in the submarine cable, when it cuts, maybe only have 50 gigs or maybe 100 gig. So your internet becomes slow. So when internet becomes slow, everybody face this kind of problem. That is the main reason. So sometimes, okay, because of the agency charge so much, sometimes they're reluctant to do the work. And currently in Penang, we have a common ducting policy, where when we have a duct, everybody have to share it. So last time Telecom owns Telecom, don't allow others, so do that. So all the telcos, the problem is they don't want to work together. They used to implement, share the infra. So currently they only share the towers because they lease it from us, they share. The equipment they don't share. You can't share the core network, but the access you can share. But the problem, they don't want to share because of, among them, the challenges. They want to make the more returns of investment and so on. So when you talk on that, so for example, now people are not talking about coverage. Last time, yes, coverage. Now coverage everybody gets. Only now people are talking about capacity and also talking about services. So once your capacity service is good and everybody comes in, still the telco mentality is more on the coverage. So this, among them, they fight each other. This is the problem.
So the issue is not as simple as having MCMC say, I want to half the price. And
Yes, no.
Yeah, so this is actually some of the discussions that is going on within the state with telco providers in addressing some of these issues.
And another one more should just add in, because all the IPs they're using routings.
Yeah.
So when you use routing, when the routing fails, these people, engineers will do manually. So when they manually, the things come slow and all kind of things. So they should have automation, right? It automatically shift to another line.
Yeah,
Yep.
okay. And I want to go back to Dr. Richard. So I'm going to try to poke the hornet's nest a bit here. You showed a pie chart there which says that Telecom Malaysia has a 92% monopoly over our telecommunications market. So in your capacity as World Bank and also the person who brings up some of these issues, have you had conversations either with Telecom or some of the telco providers, and kind of what is your sense about, I mean, everybody knows that this is a problem, but why is nothing happening?
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's clearly a problem, and as I mentioned before, Malaysia already has great laws, great regulations on competition, on anti-competitive practices and behavior, but it just hasn't quite the sort of regulatory vigor to implement. Part of it, of course, is the inevitable tension between the dividends and revenues that come from GLCs versus the sort of medium-term dynamics. And the reality is, TM would probably make less money in the short term, although maybe more in the future if it had smaller share of a bigger market, then it could certainly be win-win. But there's definitely an inherent tension and trade-off from from the fact that it's a large GLC that pays a large dividend. And there seems to be this sort of stuck low-level equilibrium between no competition, huge social responsibilities, and everyone expects, oh well, TM will do that, they'll win every public contract, and so don't bother. I mean, our sense, and we did spend, before doing this report, a lot of time talking to telcos, is immense frustration because they just cannot get fair access into the infrastructure, or it's much lower quality access, well down, what we call splicing access rather than direct sort of point of landing access. And TM sort of feels weighed down by its social responsibilities as well. So I think there's a chance to sort of relieve them a little bit of that, treat them like a regular company, I think it helps if you sort of take them out of Ministry of Finance responsibility and separate the issue of dividends and think more about the strategic, medium-term sort of direction of this industry rather than just short-term profitability and dividends. And, you know, just get on with it. I mean, we presented these findings to the government, the last government, about 6 months ago. We got a very polite hearing. Meaning not an awful lot happened. We had the chance to present this to the new Minister of Communications in June, and you know, I mean, he seems to really be getting on with this. What we also said is, you know, doubling the speed and halving the cost. Actually, Malaysia ambition should be 10 times. I mean, it should be 10 times the speed and 1/10 of the cost. I mean, what are the objective at the moment is what, 100 Mbps in urban and 30 in rural. I mean, pretty much the entire European Union has gigabit level targets by 2025, including all for the entire population. So, I mean, the level of ambition, it needs to be continuously going up. And, you know, there's a danger of always being sort of one step behind. If I want to have the mic, just quickly on SMEs. I mean, the reality is, you know, you never know. I mean, I just got a text and a WhatsApp today from the company that serviced my car saying we're offering free car health checks and 10% discount on any repairs you need as a result of that check if you come within the next week. So you never know. Maybe your motorbike repair shops, with the advent of very low cost, accessible digital technologies, it's a new way of developing business. We also had a seminar a couple of weeks ago with Facebook and Lazada. And Facebook told us they have an incredible database. There are 93 million Facebook users outside Malaysia who have a connection with an SME in Malaysia. I mean, this is an exponentially different market. So it's not just, you know, the customers who are your parents' customers, neighbors, and so on. It could totally change. And when we talked to Alibaba and Lazada, they talked about, they gave a really interesting example of a clothing maker in Malaysia. I've forgotten where she was. Doesn't speak any English, doesn't speak any Portuguese, but she had this blooming customer base in Brazil. I think it was a sort of random connection. But you know, struggling, you know, huge booming demand. She used Alibaba's translation tool to speak to her customers in Portuguese, Alibaba's fulfillment system, and an international payment system. So, you know, digital technologies can really change the sort of total parameters of business, including for SMEs, if the costs are down and it's accessible and the right environment is there.
If I can just add on to what Richard has said about the opportunities for SMEs, especially in the global market, is that with embracement of e-commerce, when they can go online, it's a very it actually helps to reduce costs significantly. Just imagine if you had to do it traditionally. If you want to export previously, SMEs would have to participate in a trade fair, spend 50,000 ringgit each time, go there, be an exhibitor, take up a booth, and start selling. Today, with e-commerce and with the digital space, you don't have to do that anymore. You can actually just take pictures of your products, put it online on your website, on Lazada, or on Amazon, and you can start selling. So, you know, that has actually brought down the cost and increase opportunities for SMEs to go global, like what you were saying just now about, like, you know, someone in Blakong or a small town in Kangar can actually be exporting to whether it's Poland or South America. I mean, it doesn't really matter because the whole world is now your market, and that kind of access is actually very important. It is brought down costs for SMEs to start exporting, because the Malaysian market is just too small for growth, and you just have to go global, whether you like it or not. If you want to reach that kind of stature in terms of development, in terms of your size of your firm or growth in your company. Yeah.
Hello? Yes. Okay, so I think that there is one take-home or kind of one point that we are driving at, which is actually SMEs now are already using digital technologies despite how expensive it is, or rather how slow it is. So in a way, like, it has already unlocked, right? But if we kind of want to think about more nuanced digital technologies. If let's say they grow, we need an SAP system, for example, enterprise systems, then this is where things start to get difficult. So I wanted to actually ask Mr. Jeffrey, I've spoken to a few really large MNCs, and their IT infrastructure is such that they have a private service provider for their internet connections. Is that also something that your company does, in the sense saying that what is available in the market today is not up to our expectations, but since we can afford it, we get a private service company to do it for us?
Well, I think broadband, like electricity as well as water, are considered infrastructure. So I'd like to drive the attention towards the implementation of digital economy in semiconductor manufacturing environment. It has gone beyond just internet connection or broadband speed. We're talking about 5G. We're talking about Internet of Things now. So we are thinking of how to use connectivity for productivity improvement. How we control our chemical dispensing with digital control. How we have our SCADA system that scan parts, moving in and out. So this is something that, of course, broadband speed is super important. But I guess I'm not a policy maker, but what will be effective for Malaysia to consider in the future will be the 5G adoption. See, I think it's granted that we have been lagging behind in terms of internet speed, broadband speed, because of lack of investment or poor quality of investment. But moving forward, the next 5 to 10 years is going to be all about 5G. It's not just our mobile phone that will be connected. Our shoes, or not just Fitbit, even our shirt, car will all be super connected. So this does not only drive up the demand for our product, the semiconductor devices, but at the same time it does give an opportunity for Malaysia, especially the policymakers, to think about what is the next strategy for 5G adoption, because there's not much really broadband you can do about it. Of course you can invest but in the old technology, but 5G is the way to go. 5G is going to be a lot more complex than 4G as well as broadband. You're going to need a lot more towers.
So I think, Dr. Richard, we did talk about this in the email, whether or not fixed broadband really is the only solution. And because since individual digital adoption is quite high, and this use 3G and 4G technology, so with 5G technology, maybe we can kind of straight leap to that rather than get into the whole hornet's nest of asking TM and some of these providers to do ducting and upgrading copper wires to fiber. You have any comments?
Can I update? When you talk about 4G, 4G is LTE.
Yeah.
So its download is about 100 meg, or 100 gig to maybe it's about 300. So it's only a single user, but they only just say that it's a 3GPP standard. But when telcos give the service to public, it is many people are going to the same tower, so the speed drops. So in Penang, the maximum speed which I find out from Maxis is only 28 meg. That's what we get. So, but when you do the testing, it goes to 100 meg download, or maybe to 300. But unfortunately, it's only single user. When you're multi-user, it's about 28 only. And when you talk about 5G, 5G is still not matured yet. Because currently, they only have talking about revision 16, because they have a revision. So for LTE 4G, the revision was until revision 13. So now we are talking about 5G, which will go until revision 16. And furthermore, in Malaysia, MCMC must come up with a license. We simply cannot use any frequency we like. So for example, we have 2.3G, and for example, we have 2.6G. So we also have TDD and FDD. So it depends on what frequency the MCMC is awarding, and we have to buy the license. License will cost few millions. And the bandwidth they give you is about 20 meg. So within the 20 meg spectrum, you will still use it. So 5G depends on the frequency, and because as the frequency increases, the number of towers should be more. It's always inversely proportional. So far, I think every telcos are telling they want to do a trial, but so far nobody have done a trial because we don't have a license.
So in that sense, we are not yet sure how reliable 4G and 5G is.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I was going to say is, Jeffrey is sort of talking about the next stage of 5G connectivity, Internet of Things, Internet of everything. And what does that mean? It needs exponential increases in data traffic, and actually even more of a requirement on high-speed fiber networks, because the 5G single, in fact, it's an even shorter distance. It'll go to the nearest tower and then into that fiber network, and that's where sort of I think doubling the speed and halving the price it becomes really apparent. It's a sort of inadequate level of ambition if we're talking about this type of leap in the year ahead. So more and more, that's why ultra fast, high capacity, competitive fiber networks are really the central way to go.
Yeah, and it's also saying, like, if we can't get our act together with high speed broadband, thinking about 5G is still quite far. So we kind of need to get our basics and foundation fixed first, the backbone, and then we can build on that for 5G as well. Yep, so I will now open the floor to questions. So if you could come to the microphone, state your name and your question. Please make it very quick. Try to refrain from comments. Ask a question. You can direct it to any one of the speakers here. Please.
Martin. I got a question direct to PDC Telco. At the moment, in Batu Kawan, we know that the telecommunication network is a bit of room to improve. All the telecommunication telco network like Maxis, DG is not working so well in Batu Kawan, and certain part of Batu Kawan we need lease line rather than using the typical Unify. So what is a PDC Telco initiative to push through this hard time, especially for industry player, because this is very crucial, especially in manufacturing.
Are you from a telco company?
Sorry?
Are you from a telco company?
No.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay. Currently, Batu Kawan, we have about 2,000 acres owned by PDC Telco, PDC, and currently we have 2 towers, which is this is on live. So all the 6 telcos are in our towers, and now currently we're building another 6 towers, which will be RFS ready for service by end of December and January. So all the telcos can come in, because when we do a tower, we'll do a RF planning. When you do RF planning, we don't put too many towers, because it depends on the telco how they do the coverage. So currently we have 2, one in Bandar Kasia and one in Honda Plan. So we're building another 6 there. And furthermore, for fiber, we have about 21 kilometer ducts and subducts. So we have 4 ducts with 12 subducts. So mostly we lease it to telcos, so they can run their own fiber, and we lease it to them. So currently, because Batu Kawan is still under construction and so on, I think so far they already sold all the 119 plots, which of 2,000 acres, and 20 factories already came up. So we have all the connection to all the telcos, to the factories, and most of the connection is by telecom, and also by time. So currently we are still upgrading the services, because currently we don't want to simply build towers everywhere and no telcos are in there. So it's already, our capex will be increasing. So, yeah.
So Martin has to increase business in Batu Kawan, then it will be faster, right?
And in PDC, in Batu Kawan, no other developers can build towers, except PDC Telco. So Maxis, DG or what, they can't build, they only lease with us.
So if it's slow, it's your fault.
Yeah, it's not our fault. Actually, okay, just to share with you, currently because the process, we have to go to all the telcos. See, when we apply for a tower to construct, we have to go to all the agencies, like for example, MCMC, JKR, TNB, DC, and so on. So once they do the approval, they call ulasan, then it comes to us, then we must do all kind of drawings and everything, we'll submit to the council. So the process of application takes a very long time. So sometimes the agency takes about 40 days. The council takes 37 days. So now, together myself and my CEO, so we try to change the process. So we never did the process. Now currently they do serial, one by one. So currently we do concurrent. So from 18 months, we are reducing to 10 months. So we try to build the structure faster. Yeah.
Good, so it's coming, Martin is coming. Any other questions from the floor?
Hello, my name is David Kaur. from Minatex. Okay, I would like to point a question to Dr. Richards about your research finding. Do you perform the research on the telco infrastructure or network before you come to this? Why Malaysia today fall to these kind of situations? Okay, so do you cover back in early 90s? Actually, in early 90s, we have accessed fiber optic. We plant a lot of fiber optic now there. But why today happen like that? So this is one of the reasons why today our fiber optic, the designer, the network topology that they do, are we, government have to make a very clear cut. Are they going for FTTS or FTTH? Even today we are not FTTH, fiber to the street or fiber to the home. So compared versus China, who are about 10 years behind us at the time in early 90s, but they already make a very clear cut. They are straight away fiber to the home. So government play a very important role, and today we look at the digital economy and all that. But in 2011, MDEC tabled a solution under NPC, near frequency communications. We have the mobile wallet that will be there, but go to the Bank Negara Malaysia, straight away rejected. But today we see Bank Negara Malaysia say, "Oh, good. The payment is good. Okay, now start to go for all the kind of payment." So actually, for me, we lag behind, not because we don't have talent in Malaysia, but because of the policymaker. They are unable to make decision because Penang is the state, we drive a lot of the high-end technology in Penang. But when we want to for the adoptions, our own country reject all this. Okay, so I hope that World Bank will spend a little bit of time to study why today cost kind of your finding, why it cost that. Then we'll make the benefit of that. I know you're the only first year here, but I hope that you can do deeper, go behind. This internet as a utility, we talked that since 9 Malaysia plan. Today we are going to end 11 Malaysia plan. So I don't know where are we heading in 12 Malaysia plan. Okay, thank you.
Dr. Richard, you want to just respond?
No, I mean, I'm an economist, but we have telecom engineers and experts in our team who helped with the analysis, and there's more detail in our digital economy report. This one just has a little bit of a summary. But I mean, I had the privilege to visit Jeffrey's factory in Batu Kawan this afternoon. I mean, this is the world-class frontier of technology. I mean, I learned a huge amount of looking at automated manufacturing, and yet you're talking about mobile phone signal problems, which seems almost unimaginable. I mean, this should be the best internet in the whole of Malaysia, and something's not quite working out that it's not. And I think that goes to the heart of the problem you're talking about. I think we start by taking an international perspective and comparing Malaysia with some of the tools and indicators that we had, and we found this unexpected result that the bulk of Malaysia's businesses were below, and that this unexpectedly high cost of internet, and we think the root of the competition is public policy choices collectively over a number of years, which means that Malaysia's fixed market ends up being somewhat distorted. I mean, the good news is the answer to that is different public policy choices. Now, taking them is not easy, although, I mean, we have been quite encouraged. I mean, in the last few months, we've seen much stronger and robust implementation of mandatory access pricing, the dissolution of the MOU between TM and TNB. I mean, again, 6 months ago, we were looking at this issue, and it was a little bit disappointing. The result was, let's join them together and make an even stronger national champion, which was not the solution that Malaysia was looking for. Now, potentially, although it's certainly not automatic, but at least having them separately, now TNB is following a different strategy. And often, I think the answer is to be creative. I mean, TNB has fiber to every electric substation in the country already. It's not being used, less than 1% utilization. The challenge now is just getting out and finding low-cost and effective and market-driven ways to access that infrastructure. I just learned that in Ethiopia, they're laying cables through sewage tunnels. So that, there's lots of different public infrastructure that can be utilized to deploy new networks, get competition in, and really it works best when you have multiple players. Again, Firas is just, I'm going to reveal something. Firas was getting internet connection in his home the other day, and it was comparing time with which he was looking at, and I have Maxis. And he can get 3 times the speed for the same price as me, but I can't get time. This is the power of competition. You need choices and multiple players, and then adoption can move forward.
Yep, thank you. We've got...
Yes, there's actually a question from Facebook Live that this lady, Ms. Kien Guante, is asking, should market open for others telco to build tower, reduce red tape for approval? I suppose that question goes to PDC Telco.
Okay. So when we talk about building towers, anybody who have network facility providers can build tower. So earlier in Penang, only PDC Telco builds because we have exclusive until 2009. So now it's open to every market. So we mostly build the towers in Penang mainly on PDC land and on government land, which the other telcos cannot build. That is the answer. And also anyone can come and build as long as they have the NFP license. And just to answer the FTTX question, so FTTX they mostly don't implement in Malaysia because the fiber they run everywhere. So every fiber they have a lambda, which is called in nanometer, which is 1310, they have 1550 and 1850 nanometer. So when you have that kind of lambda, you cannot do FTTX. FTTX mostly they have one single fiber, earlier fiber they have transmit and receive. When you talk about FTTX, they only have one fiber. Transmit and receive in the same fiber with the lambda. So they maybe use 1490 and 1310. That's why most of the houses we don't have FTTX. Because earlier fiber was all single mode. They have single mode and multi-mode. So when you run single mode with 1310, you can't do FTTX. So all the single fibers, they must have one fiber with two lambdas, and they go to splitter. So the splitter is 1:32 or 1:64. So when one splitter goes in, and it can go to 32 houses. So sometimes most of the telcos don't do that because of the fiber laying is expensive. And another one more is because of, they always say return of investment. When you go to Time Telecom, they always go to fiber to all the big condominiums. They don't go to the flats because flats, sometimes they don't really want the internet. So this is the reason why we don't have FTTX in everywhere. So like for instance in Penang, we have 3,217 kilometers of fibers in Penang, which only covers 50% of Penang Island. So still we have another 3,000 kilometers to go. If you want to do it, it costs about 600 million to do. So this is another reason. So telecom, they have a lot of coppers in Penang. So these coppers only can go from 1 meg to 4 meg only. After that, they cannot go. And we go and ask for them, they say there's no port. So when they go no port, they cannot upgrade. Sometimes some equipment can be upgraded, some equipment cannot be upgraded. So they need to do fiber. When they do fiber, they see, okay, maybe they go to a flat. So maybe the person cannot afford to buy the Unify. So that's why they don't do. So all telcos depends on ROI. No return of investment, they don't invest. This is the only thing. Unless the government gives some subsidy to them, then should, okay. Yeah.
No subsidies, free market.
No subsidy, you can't do it.
All right, can we have last 1 or 2 questions before we end the night? Yeah, Dr. Wei.
Hi, thank you everyone. Yeah, hi. I'm no expert in this field at all, so take my comment as someone who's just speaking impressionistically, as it were. I think of course it's obvious to everyone that there is a problem with the internet speed in Malaysia that should be raised, not double, but 5 times or 10 times up. To me, that's true. I'm sure it's that true, but it seems to me also that that's what a technical-minded person would see as the problem. I think there's also a problem of mindset change. I think that has been discussed or mentioned at least. But the point then is, how do you make that mindset change, right? That, of course, when any new technology comes to a society, you do have a mindset change problem. But we have been digitized 20 years or so, and still we have a mindset problem. There are two, again, just impressionistically, in my recent travels, there are 2 cases that impressed me with how the internet is used, and it's used by mobilely connected people, which Malaysians are already. And yet we don't have those apps in use properly. One was something in Stockholm for parking, right? They have fantastic apps for parking, and it really made parking very easy. If you park your car for half an hour, but you come back after 20 minutes, you can just say you park for 20 minutes, you save 10 minutes, right? Or whatever. Or you want to extend the time, you can do it while you're miles away. You don't have to get back to your car. things like that. And they did that, I just came back from Hong Kong, and I noticed that, of course, Uber and Grab, they have are disrupting the taxi business there. But then you see that the taxi business does hit back. They have their own app. They have the HK Taxi or something. And so I took the taxi once. I looked for an Uber. It was going to cost me 125 Uber. I tried the HK Taxi. 80. I mean, it doesn't show you 80, but it'll go by meter. I took that one. It cost me 80. The Uber would have cost me 125. So that taxi business actually gotten together, and they're fighting back against Uber. And it's all about mobile, but our taxi business doesn't hit back at all, right? I think you just hear complaints about it, and they're probably going to die very, very quickly. Now, the mindset change, I was wondering, again back to Sweden, I don't know if it's true or not, this is just something I've heard, that the Swedish government consciously, quite a few years ago, decided that to go digital, they had to force society to go digital. The mindset change had to be forced, and they did it by pushing the banks. They got all the banks to digitize very quickly, forcing society to, like it or not, you want to do banking, right? You have to go digital. You have to start thinking digital. And I think their banks went digital very quickly, and their banks started closing down, and they just became ATMs everywhere. And that forced the rest of society, Swedish society, to get into the act, as it were. Maybe that's something like that is needed in Malaysia. We can't pussyfoot with mindset change. It's not going to work. Yeah, just my comments. No question, actually.
Do you all want to respond? I think Dr. Richard, yes.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot of evidence around the world that people, this is the sort of behavioral aspects, that people need a nudge to often make the leap, and when they do, then the sort of path changes. Sometimes you can force. Sometimes incentives matter as well. Like, for example, in the UK, when you're submitting your taxes, your tax return, I think you have 6 months to do it by paper, but you can do it 9 months by electronic. So if you miss the deadline, you have no choice but to do it electronically. So you're not forced to do it electronically, but you're incentivized. And often, for example, for, again, compliance with public services and things, lower cost through electronic means, so passing on some of the benefits to citizens can help sort of encourage and make that leap.
Yeah, and speaking about mindset change, our parking is still Gores dan Menang system. It's the total system. I think we have one last question from online.
Yes, there's a follow-up question from the lady just now. Follow-up question. Will government reduce millions ringgit of license fees instead of subsidy give better outlook on private telcos ROI? So basically, will government reduce millions ringgit of license fees instead of subsidy given better outlook on private telcos ROI?
Okay. Currently, there is no subsidy for a license. So sometimes when they ask for a license, they charge you a few millions for a license for the band, spectrum band. If the government can give us some subsidy, then fair enough, we can cut the rate for the trunking or rate for the tower and so on. Currently, when we lease a tower, this tower is not coming from us. So we have a society or we have a consortium like we call PIPIT. So all the nationwide, we have 13 members who join, and we have a standard agreement where the pricing is controlled by everyone. So currently the price is controlled, depending on how many sharers a tower. If single sharer, the price is more expensive, 2 sharer lesser, 3 sharer lesser, and it goes on. So if you're talking about, if government is giving subsidy, why not we cut the price for all the services? Because all the telcos are just, actually they are crying when they do the infra, because it's very expensive. Running a fiber is not cheap, and putting the equipment is not cheap. And then furthermore, they have to put a diversity. They must have 2 cards, 2 power supply and everything. When one card fails, another card takes over. So most of the telcos, they don't want to put 2 cards. So when the card is faulty, so the whole thing goes down. So when everything goes down, you don't get the services. And sometimes because they're sharing the POP, so maybe let's say one card maybe carries about 30 customers. So when the card fails, all the other customer will divert to another card, which is 60 customers. So everything will be slow. So this is what is happening. So far, the government until now, there is no subsidy given at the moment.
Okay, so you have something.
I think I heard just now, what was mentioned that the coverage for fiber optics broadband is only like about what 50% or something.
50% in Penang
Yeah.
Island.
Penang Island.
Penang, yeah.
But you see, like if you look at the example of how Singapore did it, why is it that the SMEs are able to be connected? Think about the fact that they have flatted factories that are centralized, that are located in specific areas. In the case of SMEs here, they are scattered all over the island. It becomes more costly in terms of infrastructure to be making those kind of connections. But in the case of Singapore, if you go to Kaki Bukit Crescent, you go to Tuas, you see all these places, it's all flatted factories. SMEs are there. So it's very easy to have those kind of broadband connections, and that's why a lot of these SMEs are able to enjoy that. In fact, Batu Kawan should be a place. We actually submitted a memorandum to the CM. Where are the flatted factories in Penang? We've been talking about that since the previous structure plan. Ask Muru, I mean, he's aware of it. I mean, but we don't see this kind of flatted factories in a big way. I mean, this is something that, but if you go to Singapore, you have all these modern facilities, shared services, which are being used and, utilized by the SMEs. So that makes your connectivity cheaper, right? I mean, and that's probably one of the reasons why they're able to have those kind of, higher penetration as well. I mean, right? Yeah. So just some comments on that.
Just to give an example, in Batu Kawan we have IKEA there. So IKEA is so big company or something, they only ask for 30 meg internet connection. So we have to dig trunking and fiber and everything to their factory for 30 meg. So the return of investment is, we can't see the return of investment for maybe for 10 years. So that's why sometimes the requirement from the factories is too little. It is not 1 gig. Maybe they only ask for 30 meg. My house is having 30 meg. Yeah.
Right. We will have one last question.
So just one quick question.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot in the World Bank and I think others about how digital technology can be a great force multiplier. It can be an equalizer, an enabler, and so on. But we all know that digital technology can also be a disruptor. In fact, our next World Development Report in 2019 will be on the future of work. So we already are hearing about robotics, about AI, about cloud computing, about automation, and how this is going to affect the future of work. And I just wanted to ask the panel maybe to reflect on this as well, because public policy also has a role in this area too.
Thank you. And reflect we shall at home. Yeah, I think we are out of time for tonight. We thank you for coming here again. Thank you for supporting our events. Do check out our website to follow some of the things that we have. We have a video series that we are also currently recording. So actually Dr. Richard will be on YouTube pretty soon. So do check that out. And thank you everybody. We thank the World Bank team. We thank all our panel speakers for tonight and for the input. Thank you.